Welcome to the Trauma 101 training. This training was designed by the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and has additional content from the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Let's go ahead and get started. Trauma 101 is designed to help you meet the requirements outlined in Washington Administrative Code 110 145 2740, while strengthening your ability to support children, youth, and families with skill, awareness, and respect. During your pre-service training, you'll explore three core training areas: trauma-informed care, cultural humility, and LGBTQIA+ inclusion. Each of these builds on the others. Together, they will help you support safe, stable, and affirming environments for all youth, especially those who have experienced adversity or marginalization. Let's get started with Trauma 101. This training will be divided into three sections. The first one will focus on trauma definitions and types. We will define acute, chronic, complex, racial, historical, and intergenerational trauma. The second section will focus on the impact of trauma on development. We'll look at the relationships between a child's lifetime trauma history and their behaviors. Think about how culture may influence responses to traumatic events and better understand how traumatic experiences affect development throughout the lifespan. The last section will cover safety, permanency, well-being, and resilience. We'll begin exploring trauma-informed practice that support individuals. A quick note: you may work with young people of different ages, or have a more administrative job where you spend your time among adults. Either way, we invite you to apply the concepts you will learn to your work situations. Before we begin the module, take a moment to think about what you already know about the trauma-informed approach. On the Know, Wonder, Learn, or KWL chart handout, you'll see three columns: Know, Wonder, and Learn. Start by thinking about these questions. What do you already know about the trauma-informed approach? What do you wonder or hope to learn about it? You may notice that the chart on your handout looks a little different from the one shown on this slide. The last two columns are not shaded on the handout, as they are on this slide. That's because you will complete those columns later, at the end of the module. For now, focus only on the first two columns: Know and Wonder. Take about 2 minutes to write one or two ideas in each column. This training covers some intense material. For some of you, this may be the first time you are hearing information about trauma. For others, it may trigger memories from your professional or your personal lives. It is very important that you take care of yourself. Please take breaks when you need to, check in with others as needed, and think about what works for you in terms of debriefing, de-stressing, and getting support both during this training and in your day-to-day work. The work that you do every day makes a difference. Your work often doesn't receive a thank you, nor do you always get to see the positive outcomes. But what you do matters and can make an impact on how children, youth, and families heal from trauma. There are many reasons why it is important to understand trauma. It impacts people's relationships with one another. It impacts the way organizations function. It impacts people's ability to navigate daily life. Throughout the training, we will be looking at concrete skills and strategies to be more trauma-informed and increase your effectiveness in working with children and families, whether you work with them directly, write policies or procedures, manage programs, or supervise others. Individually, what you do matters, and collectively, you can make an even bigger difference. This training is not specifically about race or culture. However, understanding a person's unique life history is an important part of being trauma-informed. Throughout this training series, we will touch on concepts related to race and culture because they often intersect with trauma. The Washington State Glossary for Inclusive and Equitable Workplaces defines race as a social construct that divides common people into smaller social groups based on characteristics, most typically skin color. Racial categories were socially created. Historically, they helped establish whiteness as part of the dominant culture and were used to concentrate power and advantage people defined as white. Culture is defined as the summation of the attitudes, values, and behaviors that define who we are as a people. Culture includes many parts of identity, such as religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, foster care experience, military service, and more. Two ideas help us understand culture. The first is cultural intersectionality, the idea that people hold multiple identities at the same time. For example, someone might be a Ukrainian refugee who is also a single mother or a Native American foster parent. The second is cultural humility. This means being aware of our own biases and recognizing that learning about culture is an ongoing process. Like being trauma informed, cultural humility is not a checklist. It is a continuous learning journey. Understanding how culture, race, and trauma interact can help you adjust how you engage with the people you serve. Now we'll take a moment for a short reflection activity. First, think about your own identity. Identity includes the many experiences, roles, and characteristics that shape who we are. Take a moment to think of three things about your identity that make you different from others. These could relate to your background, experiences, values, roles, or the communities you belong to. Examples might include where you grew up, your family structure, your language, your profession, your beliefs, or other parts of your life experience. Pause the slide for a moment and write down three things that make your identity unique. Next, think about the people you work with. What might be some of the similarities and differences between you, your peers, and the children, youth, and families you serve? Consider how these similarities and differences might influence communication, understanding, trust, or perspective. Take a moment to reflect or jot down a few thoughts. Recognizing both similarities and differences can help us approach others with curiosity, respect, and cultural humility, an important part of trauma informed practice. Let's move into looking at the different types of trauma. For some of you, this may be new material, while for others, it may be a refresher. But it is important that everyone understands what trauma is and what forms it can take. Stress and trauma are often talked about together, but not all stress is harmful. In fact, there are three main types of stress. Positive stress is brief and normal. It may increase heart rate or stress hormones for a short time, but it supports healthy development. Examples include getting a shot at the doctor's office or starting the first day of school. Tolerable stress is more serious, such as a major injury or the loss of a loved one. These events activate the body's stress response, but the effects can be reduced when a child has the support of a caring adult. Toxic stress occurs when difficult experiences are ongoing, like severe poverty, domestic violence, chronic neglect, or caregiver substance use or mental health challenges. Without supportive relationships, toxic stress can disrupt brain development and lead to trauma. Not everything stressful is traumatic, and people respond to stress in different ways. Using a trauma informed approach helps create safer, more supportive environments for everyone. This module isn't about trauma, it's about being trauma informed. Most humans carry the effects of painful experiences in their lives. Dr. Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician who researches trauma and addiction. He says that trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. The emotional and psychological wounds often occur in our earliest years, but not always. Dr. Mati reminds us that we cannot change events of the past, but the possibility of healing the wounds within is always available to us. I'm going to pause here for just a moment as you reflect on this definition of trauma. Do you think it is a helpful way to think about trauma? Trauma occurs from an event or series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Take a moment to come up with one or two examples of traumatic events. Some examples may include a sudden loss of contact with a parent, caregiver, or sibling, exposure to substance use or unsafe behaviors by caregivers, feeling powerless during court proceedings or case decisions, experiencing violence due to identity. Our own unresolved trauma can impact and influence how we work with both children and adults. It is important for us to learn how trauma might show up in the responses of those we interact with. It is equally important to understand how the effects of trauma might show up in our own responses as well. To understand the impact of trauma on children, youth, and families, it can be helpful to think about trauma as acute or chronic. Acute trauma is a single traumatic event that is limited in time. Examples include a natural disaster, a serious accident, sudden or violent loss of a loved one, and a physical or sexual assault. This is not to say that the impact of an acute traumatic event is short lived. It may take months or even years for a person to recover from an acute trauma. Chronic trauma results from ongoing or repeated experiences that deeply affect a person's body and or mind. They may be varied and or long-standing events. For instance, experiencing or witnessing domestic violence, ongoing stigma or harm because of gender identity, long-standing emotional or physical neglect, or sexual, physical, or emotional abuse that is ongoing. Understanding the difference between acute and chronic trauma helps us recognize how varied traumatic experiences can be. It also reminds us that trauma is not defined only by the event itself, but by the lasting impact it can have on a person's well-being. Complex trauma occurs when a child experiences multiple traumatic events, either at the same time or over a period of time. These experiences are often caused by one or more primary caregivers. Child maltreatment, including neglect or physical, emotional, or psychological abuse by a parent or trusted adult, represents a profound breach of a child's most important relationship. When this type of trauma is severe, ongoing, or frequent, it can affect many areas of development. Children may struggle to form healthy attachments, regulate their emotions, or focus and learn. Many young people involved in DCYF programs have histories of complex trauma related to child maltreatment. A report from the Children's Bureau examining child maltreatment cases across the United States in 2017 found that more than 91% of substantiated cases involved one or both parents as the perpetrators. Without safety, protective relationships, and supportive environments, exposure to complex trauma can increase the likelihood of additional traumatic experiences. Providing those protective factors is an essential part of supporting healing and recovery. The definition of historical trauma we're discussing today is rooted in the work of Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart and guidance from the National Native Children's Trauma Center. Historical trauma is the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations, which emanates from massive group trauma experience. Historical trauma is closely connected to ethnocide and genocide directed at people of color, including Black and Indigenous communities. Some examples include slavery, forced removal from homelands, displacement, massacres, and cultural and racial oppression. To understand historical trauma, it is important to understand its origins. Dr. Marilyn Bruguiere Zimmerman is the founding director of the University of Montana's National Native Children's Trauma Center. In the next short video clip, Dr. Zimmerman discusses the origins of historical trauma among Indigenous people in North America. As you watch, consider how historical events can shape the experiences of individuals, families, and communities across generations.
Thanks, Cody and Denise. As they've introduced, I'm Marilyn Bruguiere Zimmerman, and I'm an enrolled citizen of the Nakota people that live on the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, Sioux Reservation in Montana. And a big part of our way of honoring people in our community, those that we respect, those that we want to acknowledge as leaders, we often give a star quilt to. And the star quilt is made up of 8 points, and the points represent our ancestors reaching down from the stars and our people reaching up in order to create this wholesome, vibrant community. And so what we're going to be talking a little bit about today is becoming trauma informed and what that looks like for trauma-informed family engagement of Native families. So I like to think about our tribe and all of the tribes in North America were this intact, beautiful star quilt. It was the fabric of the community, the fabric of the tribe. It was wholesome, it was vibrant, but with European contact, the very fabric of our tribal families and communities was torn. And we really sustained a lack of connectedness, like the star quilt represents that connectedness of the stars. Our tribal practices, including our ceremony and spiritual practices, were impacted by colonization. So when Europeans settled in North America, the fabric of tribal families was torn. The tribal communities were decimated through colonization. What is thought by many of the most detrimental practices of assimilation to children, families, and the entire tribe was really that the boarding school experience, when generations of children were removed from their nurturing, loving, supportive families and communities. And instead of growing up as cherished members of wholesome families, they experienced the trauma of separation, endured maltreatment and neglect, and often experienced the trauma of abuse, both emotional, psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. And they came home lacking strong cultural identity and struggled with finding their place in their families and communities. Many developed unhealthy coping strategies like substance use or physical violence or abuse. Many struggle with suicidal thoughts. We continue to struggle with chronic health issues. And but we really do believe, many of us tribal members, that what has been the most impactful is the lack of knowledge about how to parent our children in loving, nurturing cultural ways.
Dr. Zimmerman describes the cultural and historical trauma experienced by the Nakota people in Montana. But the process of separating families and attempting to erase cultural identity has not been limited to one group. Trauma and violence have been and continue to be directed at Indigenous and marginalized people across the nation. Colonialism perpetuates these practices around the world. Historical trauma and its effects stem directly from actions by state and federal governments. For example, the forced removal of Native American children from their homes, the enslavement of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, immigration policies, continuing racism. Let's talk about the relationship of historical trauma with intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma refers to trauma that affects a single family across two or more generations. While it's sometimes used interchangeably with historical trauma, intergenerational trauma typically occurs within one family rather than across an entire community or group. Traumatic experiences in childhood or adulthood can influence a person's parenting and family environment, and these impacts can be passed down through family norms, beliefs, habits, and even socioeconomic conditions. When you look at this image, what thoughts or feelings come to mind? Take a moment to reflect. Now, what if I told you that before I was born, my mother survived a tsunami, but lost the home she grew up in, and many of her friends and family members died? How do you think I would feel when looking at the same image above? My response to this photo could be anxious, triggered, and scared. It is possible that my mother would have instilled fear in me about water due to her own experiences. While I did not survive or even witness the tsunami, I came to have negative feelings about water, the ocean, and beaches. This is an example of how trauma can be passed on intergenerationally through family beliefs, norms, and habits. Racial trauma refers to the emotional pain and stress that can result from experiencing or witnessing racism, discrimination, or structural prejudice. For many people, these experiences build over time and can contribute to the cumulative challenges faced by groups who have also experienced historical trauma. One common form of racism and discrimination is microaggressions. These are everyday verbal, nonverbal, or environmental slights, snubs, or insults that target people from marginalized groups. They may be intentional or unintentional, but they can still have a harmful impact. For example, asking someone, "What are you?" in reference to their race, ethnicity, or nationality may seem harmless. However, questions like this can make a person feel singled out and may cause them to question their identity and sense of belonging. For more examples of racial microaggressions, please refer to the handout. It is important to keep in mind that both historical trauma and racial trauma may be experienced not only by the children and families you work with, but also by you and your own family, friends, colleagues, and community. Your own experiences or the experiences of those around you may impact your perception of others' experiences. Take a moment to pause your screen and reflect on these questions. How does understanding historical and intergenerational trauma shape how you approach the people you serve? Also, consider what strategies could help encourage healing in the context of historical and intergenerational trauma, such as building trust, honoring cultural strengths, and supporting safe, supportive relationships. Childhood bereavement occurs when someone important in a child's life dies. This loss may be sudden or anticipated. It is one of the most common of trauma for children and adolescents. Grief is a natural response, but it can show up in different ways. Adaptive reactions may include reminiscing, expressing feelings, or finding a sense of meaning over time. However, bereavement can also lead to significant emotional or behavioral distress and may interfere with healthy grieving. Maladaptive reactions can include persistent, intense distress, ongoing mental preoccupation with the loss, or difficulty maintaining a comforting connection to the person who died. Children may also struggle to hold balanced memories, sometimes seeing the person as entirely good or entirely bad, and may experience challenges with identity or purpose. Recognizing these responses helps us better support children through grief. Traumatic separations can be sudden, unexpected, and prolonged. They can be accompanied by additional stressful events. For children and youth in DCYF's programs, their removal from the home or their parents' removal, incarceration, deportation, or termination of rights are some of the situations in which traumatic separation may occur. Traumatic separation can also apply to other relationships, such as those with grandparents and siblings. Traumatic separation may have an impact on parents and caregivers as well. Though similar in nature, traumatic separation differs from childhood bereavement in that the child may spend a great deal of time hoping for reunification, even if it cannot occur for years, if at all. This can impede the child's ability to cope effectively. Despite the system's best intentions, being involved in DCYF programming can expose children to system-induced trauma and re-traumatization. Trauma and loss are endemic to foster care. The losses continue to accumulate with removal, placement changes, educational disruptions, canceled visits, sibling separations, etc. In the event a child has experienced multiple traumas, their ability to overcome future trauma is compromised, creating a cycle of loss. This reinforces a child's beliefs that they are worthless, that people are untrustworthy, and that the world is unpredictable and hostile. Some studies have shown that up to 30% of youth in foster care experience additional maltreatment while a dependent or ward of the court. Some racial and cultural minority groups and individuals who identify as LGBTQIA+ may experience trauma at higher rates due to discrimination, exposure to violence, and systemic inequities. It is important to realize that how you approach a case and what you communicate to a child, parent, or other caregiver can have either a positive or negative impact for that child and family. Even when circumstances are outside your control, using a trauma-informed approach can make a meaningful difference for children and families. We've covered many different types of trauma in this section. The next part will go into detail about the impact of trauma. This is a good point to pause if you need to take a break. Now that you have an understanding of what trauma is, we are going to talk about how it impacts children and adolescents, starting with the brain. Let's start with a brief overview of brain development. In simple terms, the interaction of genes and experiences shapes the brain. A substantial proportion of the brain is built in the early years of life, within an environment of caregiver relationships, but the brain continues to build over time. Between birth and age 3, more than 1 million neural connections are made each second. These neural connections or structures are called synapses, and they allow nerve cells to communicate with other cells. Learning requires forming new synapses as well as strengthening and discarding existing ones. Early synapses are weak and need repeated exposure to strengthen. meaning simply that people learn from repetition. This is why you have to repeat yourself over and over and over. To very young children, the brain adapts to one's environment. This can be either positive or negative, depending on the environment. If you are in an environment that is characterized by violence or neglect, then the synapses that are strengthened may be those that help you identify danger instead of those conducive to learning and meeting early milestones like walking and talking. It has been observed that the brain develops from the bottom up, starting with the primitive brain. Think basic survival, which is the brainstem. After the primitive brain, more complex parts of the brain develop. Think rational thought, planning, abstract thinking, which is the prefrontal cortex. The first 3 years of life are a busy time for brain development, but it continues to develop throughout childhood and into adulthood. This graphic shows us the images of brains from age 5 to 20, illustrating the maturation of the different parts of the brain over time. The last part to mature is the prefrontal cortex, which impacts skills related to self regulation and decision making. This happens in a person's mid 20s. People learn by experience. So, how does a traumatic experience impact a person? Imagine that you are taking a walk at the park near your home and suddenly in front of you is a huge snake. How might you react? You may be ready to fight by attacking the snake. You may want to run away, this is flight, or you might just freeze and stand and stare at the snake. Let's review an important body response that happens when a person feels threatened: the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. This response occurs when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, preparing the body to deal with danger. It increases heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing while sending blood to the muscles. At the same time, digestion slows and the immune system temporarily weakens. The sympathetic nervous system also triggers the release of stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol, which further fuel the stress response. This reaction is a normal, automatic biological response when someone perceives a threat. When a person feels overwhelmed, it may show up as fighting or yelling, running away or shutting down, becoming unresponsive or trying to please or appease the threat to avoid harm. Now imagine you are walking through that same park a couple days later. How might you feel about walking there again? More than likely, you would be watching the ground carefully for snakes. You are likely to startle if you see a stick on the path, even before the thought, ah, snake, is in your conscious awareness. Even if you had been in the park many times before without seeing a snake changes your perception of the park and makes you expect danger. That's because it is a lot more dangerous to mistake a snake for a stick than to see a snake in every stick. Brains are wired this way to generalize in the direction of looking out for danger for protective reasons. Let's use the example of seeing a snake to understand how the body responds to trauma. When you think you've seen a snake, your body automatically activates its alarm system, known as the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. This response begins in the primitive part of the brain, which is responsible for survival. Stress hormones are released so the body can react quickly to danger. At the same time, more advanced parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, work to think through what's happening. When you realize that what you saw was actually a stick and not a snake, these higher brain centers signal the body to calm down and the stress response turns off. However, when someone experiences chronic or repeated trauma, the brain can remain on high alert for danger. The body's emergency response system may get stuck in the on position. When the body's stress response system stays activated, stress hormones can continue flowing through the body. This can make it harder for the prefrontal part of the brain, the area responsible for thinking and planning, to work effectively. These stress hormones and related brain chemicals can also interfere with rational thinking and decision making. It can also become difficult to concentrate or stay focused. As a result, people may show increased aggressiveness or react more strongly to situations they perceive as threatening. Some individuals may become numb to danger, while others may feel constantly fearful or on edge. These reactions are common responses when the brain and body have been under prolonged stress. It is important to understand that trauma reactions are not the same for all children or adults. You need to look at each person as a unique individual with unique experiences. Don't assume that a youth is traumatized simply because they were a part of an event that was traumatic. You need to rely on mental health screening and/or assessment and the youth or caregiver report about how they are functioning. It is also important to note that it is easier to identify when a youth is traumatized when their response is acting out with overt behaviors. However, some youth tend to internalize their symptoms, and they may be overlooked because they are described as a quiet or compliant child. People respond differently to stressors and traumatic events. The impact of a potentially traumatic experience can vary widely from person to person. Several factors influence how someone is affected. These include a person's age and developmental stage, and how dangerous they believe the situation was. It also matters whether the person experienced the event directly or witnessed it, and their relationship to the victim or the person responsible. Other important factors include past experiences with trauma, other adversities before or after the event, and whether supportive adults are available to provide help and protection. Because these factors can combine in many ways, people may respond very differently to the same traumatic event. This is often seen within families, where siblings experience the same trauma but react differently. Cultural intersectionality also plays a role. A person's racial and cultural background can shape how trauma is understood, experienced, and treated. Historical and intergenerational trauma may also influence how caregivers and communities respond to trauma. Sometimes trauma responses are triggered even when there is no current danger. Trauma reminders occur when the brain connects a past traumatic experience to sensory cues. These reminders can be triggered by any of the five senses. For example, in the snake scenario, the stick acted as a reminder. Other cues, like the smell of pine in the forest, could also trigger the same fear response, even when no snake is present. These automatic reactions can lead to behaviors like aggression, withdrawal, or emotional numbness as forms of self-protection. This is why a trauma-informed approach focuses on asking, "What happened to you?" rather than, "What is wrong with you?" In the past, experts believed young children were not affected by trauma. Today, we know that even very young children can store traumatic experiences in memory. Implicit memories are unconscious and can form very early in life. Explicit memories, which we can consciously recall and describe, typically develop as language skills emerge around age 2. Because of this, young children who experience trauma may not remember specific events, but they can retain implicit memories of the physical or emotional sensations. For example, an infant exposed to domestic violence may later react with fear to a loud male voice. Even without a clear memory of the event, the sound can trigger the implicit memory and emotional response. While the impact of early trauma may be distinct, trauma can impact memory formation in later developmental stages as well. Now let's watch a video that provides some information on the impact of trauma on the brain. In the video, they refer to the upstairs and downstairs brain, which corresponds to what we talked about earlier regarding the brain building from the bottom up. The downstairs brain is the brainstem, and the upstairs brain is the prefrontal cortex.
So for a child who's had repeated exposure to fearful experiences, whether those be sort of a trauma like a car accident, or whether it's developmental or relational trauma, where the caregiver was frightening or they were left for long periods of time to manage their own fear states. The downstairs brain has gotten a lot of practice being active. It's the repeated experiences that we have that actually activate growth and connection in the brain. So if a child has had a lot of experiences where their downstairs brain that was reactive and fearful, that part of the brain gets really well developed. Whereas then the upstairs brain that knows how to calm that fear and kind of do that self-soothing, like, oh, that was a scary noise, but I'm okay now. That part of the brain may not be as well developed in children who have had repeated fearful experiences.
The impact goes beyond the upper and lower floors. The fear and stress of trauma also affect the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which help coordinate logic and emotion.
The left brain specializes in logical, literal, linear, and linguistic, which is using words, and those modes of processing information and going about in the world. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, is much more closely connected to emotion, to sensations in our bodies, to kind of looking at the whole picture as opposed to bits and pieces, and more random ways of processing information as opposed to linear. And the important part is that they work together as a coordinated whole. When children are in situations where their needs are not responded to, where their emotional states are not understood, or there is not a caregiver who responds consistently, quickly, and in an attuned way, the right hemisphere does not get nurtured. It doesn't get developed optimally. So when one side takes over, we can either be cut off from our emotions or we can become flooded by them.
It's not just our emotional balance that gets upset by trauma. It also disturbs the delicate balance between our brain chemistry and the hormones that drive our central nervous system and our entire being. In times of stress, our bodies produce the hormone cortisol, revving our bodies to a state of high alert. Periodic stress and short bursts of cortisol actually stimulate growth and help us adapt and change. When stress stays too high for too long, toxic levels of cortisol become corrosive and can lead to a host of long-term problems. Rockefeller University neuroscience professor Dr. Bruce McEwen is noted for his pioneering work on the impact of stress on the brain.
In a chronic stress situation, our lab has shown that dendrites in some parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, will shrink and communication will be impaired.
Most critically, Dr. McEwen says chronic stress takes a heavy toll on the vital front part of the brain that controls emotion, memory, and attention.
The prefrontal cortex is very vulnerable, and when there is chaos in a child's life, lack of good attachment, development of the prefrontal cortex is severely affected. And it's involved in the downstream control of everything that's going on, whether it's impulsivity, whether it's aggression, anxiety. It helps control mood. It helps a person make decisions when to stop something, to do something else. It's the brain area that is so important for self-regulation, which is so important for success in everything that we do as adults.
Dr. McEwen is a best-selling author, former president of the Society for Neuroscience, and expert contributor for the PBS series This Emotional Life.
Early life adversity and toxic stress is often associated with increased frequency of disorders like obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, as well as brain problems such as substance abuse, antisocial behavior, depression.
When a child stays in elevated states of stress, that cortisol stress hormone washes over the brain and washes through their body. And we know that brains that are exposed to chronic cortisol look different from healthy brains.
And I'm wondering if we can outline the paper.
Doctors Karen Purvis and David Cross have conducted extensive testing on children who have experienced early harm. They've found severe imbalances in cortisol and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers the brain sends the body. Some excite and some calm, and trauma can dramatically upset the balance.
A young child who is getting optimal care has a balance in the brain chemistry. The chemicals about I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm cold, those are called excitatory, are balanced when the caregiver comes and gives warmth. And then the chemicals about I'm safe, I'm fed, I'm loved, we call those inhibitory, come into play. And so this child has excitatory but then inhibitory. So there's a balance in the brain chemistry. If a child has early trauma or harm, even brief early trauma or harm, these systems become imbalanced so that I'm afraid, I'm hungry, I'm scared, I'm lonely, takes precedence. And there's very little of what would come when the needs were met. For children that we have seen over the years, and we've done neurotransmitter tests to test the level of this chemistry on more than 2,500 children. And what we find is dramatic levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, dopamine, beta-phenylethylamine, norepinephrine. We find glutamate that causes seizures very high. in many of the children.
And research shows these imbalances also raise the risk for mental health issues and lots of behavioral issues. The takeaway message is this: trauma damages the brain, especially a young developing brain. It alters brain structure and upsets the delicate balance of brain chemistry that drives behavior. It puts a child at risk for a lifetime of problems.
I'm sorry.
But if you know the risk factors that predispose a child to harm, you'll be in a better position to quickly intervene and minimize the damage.
As you saw in the video, there are clear effects of trauma on the brain. There is an effects of trauma on the brain information sheet in the handout that summarizes the information from the video. Trauma can lead to long-term changes in brain structures that affect how a person responds to stress in the future. As reflected in the notes on this postcard, created by a foster care alum, mental health challenges can emerge when there is a mismatch between the world the brain adapted to survive in and the environment a person experiences later in life. We have covered a lot of material, so let's take a moment to pause and do a grounding exercise. Grounding is one way to help protect yourself from trauma and to bring yourself back to the present. This activity calls for movement. If you have any physical limitations, please adapt this activity so that it works for you. Stand up, or if you cannot stand up, sit up with your back straight in your chair and place your feet flat on the ground. Notice your soles and the sensations you feel. Notice how your feet feel with the connection they have made. Rest your arms gently by your side. Scan your body slowly for areas of tension, areas of unrest or stress. Maybe your head or neck is tight. Maybe you notice your shoulders are held high. Let go of any knots in your stomach or your heart. Relax your arms, your hands. Relax your legs. Wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes. Just relax. Now notice your breathing. Is it fast and labored? Maybe it is already slow and steady. Just take a moment to become aware. Now focus on your breathing. Let's do this 3 times. Breathe in deep and breath out, pushing the air through your nostrils. Breathe in with awareness. Breath out with strength and purpose. Again, breathe in with awareness. Breath out with strength and purpose. Last time, breathe deeply, pulling the breath into your stomach, feeling your rib cage and lungs expand. Now breath out, pushing the air out of your lungs, out of your nose, out with strength. Thanks for taking a moment to practice. Grounding activities like this one help bring attention back to the present moment when emotions or stress feel overwhelming. They are especially useful during anxiety, grief, or trauma responses, helping people feel safer and more in control. Grounding can be used both in the moment of distress and proactively to support emotional regulation. Next, let's look at the potential long-term effects of childhood trauma. One way experts are now able to understand the long-term impacts of trauma is to look at the emerging area of epigenetics. This is an area of scientific research that shows how experiences actually affect the expression of genes. The genes you inherit from your biological parents provide information that guides your development. For example, genes might influence height, hair color, or your chance of getting a disease. Experiences during development can rearrange the epigenetic marks that impact gene expression. They can change whether and how genes release the information they carry. Positive experiences like having a supportive adult or a healthy home environment can positively impact genetic expression, whereas experiences like abuse and neglect can negatively impact genetic expression. For instance, the negative experiences may turn on genes that cause disease. Recent research demonstrates that there may be ways to reverse certain negative changes to gene expression and restore healthy functioning. For more information, refer to the handouts for the What is Epigenetics infographic. The bond between a child and their caregiver directly shapes how a child experiences and recovers from trauma. Children look to caregivers to understand whether they are safe. A calm, regulated caregiver helps a child feel secure and process difficult experiences, especially for young children who are still developing the brain capacity to self-regulate. When trauma is interpersonal, caregivers and children can become traumatic reminders for one another, an important dynamic that must be recognized and addressed. Ultimately, supporting the caregiver is inseparable from supporting the child. Healing happens in relationship. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that happen before the age of 18. They fall into 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, things like witnessing domestic violence or growing up with a caregiver experiencing mental illness or substance use. ACEs are more common than many people realize. More than 60% of adults have experienced at least one. And the more ACEs a child experiences, the greater their risk for challenges in health, learning, and relationships later in life. But here's what's most important to hold on to. ACEs are not destiny. Supportive relationships and healing-centered environments can make all the difference. That's exactly why this work matters. We're going to learn more about adverse childhood experiences in this video.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Anda and Felitti tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems, and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students, instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
A key takeaway here is that what is predictable is preventable. ACEs aren't destiny. They're a tool for understanding and responding to adversity. To understand a child's experience, we have to start with the adults around them. From birth, children are completely dependent on caregivers, not just for basic needs, but for learning, safety, and connection. That makes the adults in a child's life a critical part of their environment. When a parent or caregiver carries their own trauma, past or present, it can affect their ability to be present and attuned. They may not even recognize harmful experiences as abuse if those experiences mirror their own childhood, and that trauma doesn't always begin with them. It may be rooted in historical or intergenerational trauma passed down through families and communities. Understanding this helps us respond with compassion rather than judgment. It is important to understand that with all of trauma's impacts, there are ways that you can help foster healing. The process of recovering from trauma and developing resilience is largely dependent on supportive and enduring relationships. Before we talk about resilience, we'll explore the brain's ability to change and adapt. The video you're about to watch brings this to life. As you watch, think about what this means for healing.
Not so long ago, many scientists believed that the brain did not change after childhood, that it was hardwired and fixed by the time we became adults. But recent advances in only the last decade now tell us that this is simply not true. The brain can and does change throughout our lives. It is adaptable, like plastic. Hence, neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. How does neuroplasticity work? If you think of your brain as a dynamic, connected power grid, there are billions of pathways or roads lighting up every time you think, feel, or do something. Some of these roads are well-travelled. These are our habits, our established ways of thinking, feeling, and doing. Every time we think in a certain way, practice a particular task, or feel a specific emotion, we strengthen this road. It becomes easier for our brains to travel this pathway. Say we think about something differently, learn a new task, or choose a different emotion. We start carving out a new road. If we keep travelling that road, our brains begin to use this pathway more, and this new way of thinking, feeling, or doing becomes second nature. The old pathway gets used less and less and weakens. This process of rewiring your brain by forming new connections and weakening old ones is neuroplasticity in action. The good news is that we all have the ability to learn and change by rewiring our brains. If you have ever changed a bad habit or thought about something differently, you have carved a new pathway in your brain and experienced neuroplasticity firsthand. With repeated and directed attention towards your desired change, you can rewire your brain.
Resilience isn't a fixed trait, it's a dynamic process. It grows and shifts as a child navigates adversity over time. That process happens in the space between who a child is on the inside, their strengths, temperament, and capacity, and what exists around them on the outside, their relationships, community, and resources. Resilience is never just one thing. It's the culmination of all of these factors working together. Resilience is the ability to cope with adversity and adapt to challenges, and it's something individuals, families, and communities all practice. It can look like regulating your emotions through mindful breathing, or making a bigger life change to reduce stress. Both internal and external adjustments matter. But we have to name something important. The concept of resilience has sometimes been misused, placing the burden of systemic racism, ableism, and homophobia on the very people harmed by those systems. People of color, those who are disabled, and LGBTQIA+, and two-spirit communities should not simply be expected to become stronger to withstand injustice. True resilience must be supported by systems that are fair, just, and equitable. Thanks to neuroplasticity, we now know the brain can change, and that has profound implications for how we understand resilience. But first, let's clear up some common misconceptions. Resilience is not something a person either has or doesn't have. It's not a single trait. It's a combination of internal and external factors that shift over time. It's also not a fixed outcome. Resilience ebbs and flows across a lifetime. Someone who demonstrates it today may struggle in 5 years, and someone struggling today may flourish later. And perhaps most importantly, resilience is not bouncing back untouched. For children and youth facing serious hardship, struggle and suffering are often part of forging resilience. It's not about returning to who they were before trauma. It's about growing through it. We know many systems don't serve everyone equitably. It can feel too big for any one person to change. But Dr. Sean Ginwright reminds us that we do make a difference, individually and collectively. His work on healing-centered engagement shows us that culture, relationships, and shared values are what drive real change. And after years of research, he tells us the most challenging step isn't fixing old systems, it's daring to imagine new ones. That opportunity is in front of us right now. In every interaction you have with a child, a family, or a colleague, you are part of the healing. Resilience shows up not just in individuals, but in whole communities. Throughout history, people have drawn on their culture, relationships, and shared identity to get through hard times. Indigenous individuals, families, and tribes are a powerful example, surviving generations of historical trauma through connection to culture, community, and one another. This is what cultural resilience means. Healing doesn't only come from within a person, it also comes from the people and traditions around them. When we recognize culture as a source of strength, we open up a more complete and affirming picture of what resilience really looks like.
Resilience is not some magical quality. It's something that really can be built, even in difficult circumstances.
The key active core ingredient to building resilience are the relationships the kids have to others who care about them.
Of course, families play a very important role, but nobody raises children in isolation. We have a huge amount of research to show the powerful impacts of teachers, coaches, other adults in the community with whom children have a chance to develop relationships, who play that critical supportive role of building resilience. As a result of responsive interaction, children build simple skills of coping and adapting. How to stop crying, how to regulate your behavior, being able to defer gratification.
You have an adaptive toolkit that allows you at moments of stress or challenge to bring out a number of potential skills that allow you to get through it.
As children get older, the sophistication of those skills increases. Being able to monitor situations, solve problems. The way we as a society can nurture the development of resilience is to help communities to pay more attention to building the capabilities of the adults who care for children and provide the supports they need to tip the scales toward more positive life outcomes.
And then when communities say, we want to be an active part of crafting the solution to really understand what's necessary to produce the resilience, that's when the ball gets rolling.
Resilience building, capacity building, is really in everyone's interest, and everyone reaps the benefits when we do that well.
Being trauma-informed means believing that healing is possible, and healing-centered means actively supporting it. While many Western approaches focus on individual healing, many cultures understand healing as something that happens in community, through relationships, tradition, ceremony, and shared values. That might look like seeking guidance from an elder, observing prayer, connecting with nature, or simply sharing a meal with family. These are not small things. They are powerful sources of healing. And because each of us carries a unique history, culture, and experience, healing will look different for everyone. There is no single path. So take a moment to reflect. What does healing mean to you? Is it the absence of illness, self-love, connection to others and the world around you? Protective factors are the skills and supports that help us heal after trauma. They can be internal, like problem solving or managing our emotions, or external, like having our basic needs met and people we can lean on. As we build these factors, we can turn painful experiences into real growth, deeper relationships, new possibilities, and more compassion for ourselves and others. And remember, healing happens in community. Building resilience together can reduce the lasting effects of trauma. Everyone has protective factors, internal and external supports that help us cope with and recover from trauma. Internal factors include things like problem-solving skills, hope, and emotional regulation. External factors include support from family, friends, and community. There's no one-size-fits-all formula for resilience, but these factors make a real difference. Internal factors are personal strengths and traits. And the good news is, research shows they can be learned. For example, practicing gratitude, even something as simple as saying thank you, helps build positive relationships and strengthen resilience. External factors are the resources and supports around us, from family to school to community. For young children especially, these outside supports are critical while they're still developing internal skills. No single factor does it alone. It's the combination, and how present these factors are in someone's life, that shapes recovery. And one thing stands out in the research: a stable, caring relationship with a supportive adult is one of the strongest predictors of healing for children and youth after trauma. Look at your handout and spend a couple minutes on the bottom of the How Can You Influence Resilience worksheet. Write down some ideas you have for promoting resilience among those you work with. This slide matches the strategies on the How Can You Influence Resilience from the handouts. Press pause and review the practices you can try. Let's take a moment to revisit where we started. At the beginning of this training, we introduced 3 areas of focus. First, trauma definitions and types, and we hope you now have a clearer understanding of what acute, chronic, complex, racial, historical, and intergenerational trauma look like. Second, the impact of trauma on development, including how a child's lifetime experiences shape their behaviors, how culture influences the way trauma is experienced and interpreted, and how adversity affects us across the lifespan. And finally, safety, permanency, well-being, and resilience, recognizing that trauma-informed practice is essential to achieving real, lasting outcomes for children and families. Whether you work directly with young people or in a more administrative role, we hope these concepts feel relevant and alive in your work. You came in with knowledge and experience, and we hope this training has added new layers to the way you see, understand, and respond to the people around you. Thank you for being here. Okay, we covered a lot of ground. Take a look at the No Wonder Learn chart that you filled out at the beginning of this training. We're going to focus on the last two columns. What did you learn about trauma-informed and healing-centered practices? What do you still wonder or want to learn about? Click pause on the slides so that you can jot down your notes. As you complete this training, remember that trauma-informed care is an ongoing learning journey. In the coming months, you'll continue building your skills through additional trainings, including trauma insight, building a safe place for youth, understanding and reducing trauma, reactions in children, and dealing with feelings and behaviors. Each step will deepen your ability to support safety, connection, and healing. And that brings us to the close of Trauma 101. We know this content can be heavy. Sitting with the realities of trauma in the lives of the children and families you serve, and perhaps in your own life, takes courage and compassion. But we want to leave you with this. Healing is real. Resilience is real. And the work you do every single day matters more than you may know. Every moment of connection, every act of care, every time you choose to see a child or family through a trauma-informed lens, that is healing-centered work in action. You are part of something meaningful. Thank you for showing up for this learning and for showing up for the people you serve.